Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Riku and I am delighted to be the host of today's member series talk. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We acknowledge and are critical of the harms and ongoing legacy of colonialism and colonial attitudes as we discuss ideas and ongoing research within the space here at Green College, UBC. For those looking at the recording, the Resident Member Series is a public event at Green College that features a different presenter or presenters from the resident members of the college. Graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and visiting scholars share their research or related topic in their field. With that, I am thrilled to introduce Jacob Zimmer tonight. He's a theater maker, facilitator, and dramaturge. Ooh. Born in Cape Breton, growing up in Halifax, studying in Vancouver, spending 15 years in Toronto, Jacob now lives in Whitehorse when he isn't at UBC completing his MFA in theater directing. A while back, he received a BFA from Fraser University's School for Contemporary Arts. Today, he will kind of give us a presentation titled Mangle of Practice. With that,
thank you.
Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Riku, for the intro, and Mishi and Michael for all your help in the organizing of these things. Organizing things, which is one of the main practices of theater, is really hard and should be toasted whenever it's done. So thank you. This is a mangle. It's like when we get mangled, most of us maybe don't use them so much, but this is what they're for. They're laundry workers, machines, and so that's where we get our mangle. The mangle of practice as a term for me comes from Andrew Pickering, who's a British philosopher, historian of science. And he wrote a book in 1995 called The Mangle of Practice, and it's part of a larger move within the history and philosophy and science and technology at the time. If I'm honest about where I know the book from and the term, it's from CBC Ideas, How to Think About Science. So this is a very early, I based everything in my life on a podcast. But this was a 2008 series for Ideas produced by David Cayley, largely about the sort of shift in the history and philosophy of science in Europe towards actor network and towards sort of other ways of understanding science beyond how it had been up to then, which I'll go into. So in his words, a mangle of practice is a practice as a dialectic of resistance and accommodation, is what he has called the mangle of practice. In part on the radio, he's very humble about saying that if you call something a dialectic of resistance and accommodation, that is a very long thing to type over and over again and as academic, and so he went with the mangle of practice. And so he, in this book, is really looking at the practice of science and how the practice of science, the sort of material conditions, the social conditions around a lab, the objects that are in front of you in terms of technology, how that impacts what gets studied and what the results are. And sort of what we know is wrapped up in how we work and the objects around which we work. And in this sort of I want to do this thing. Oh, there's some resistance. Oh, now I've figured out a way around it. And so that is more of the process rather than a sort of very clean, I have a hypothesis, and on we go to prove or disprove, but that it is actually this sort of back and forth. And so my words for modeling happens in time or over time, and in dynamics, I prefer entanglement and adaptation, in part because I think the resistance and accommodation, it just seems like a bummer, and I actually think this is quite a positive practice, and so it's not a sort of thing of, oh, I don't get what I want, so there's resistance, and then I accommodate it, and I do lesser than, but that actually we're working through entanglements that we are all a part of and have no choice but to be a part of, and so how do we practice our way through those entanglements and adapt our practices as they need to be. One of the things that came up in the show that I'll be talking a lot about in this talk is a quote, "All models are wrong, some models are useful," by George Box, which he, like, on the internet is like, yeah, he said something like that a lot, but like, it's not quite a quotable term. But it's like, yeah, it's a very common idea. And I'll talk about how it came into the show. One of the things that I always make important too is, like, all models are wrong, some models are useful, sometimes for some people, which is, I think, in the original quote is unnecessary extra wordage, but that's sometimes my style. And when I talk about models, I think theater, for example, is a model that is probably wrong, but maybe sometimes useful. And to say very clearly, whoa, that slide change is really different. Sorry. There's a few of those, just a heads up. That there's a whole bunch of black holes and wells of problems inside of theater. I'm going to be talking about theater practice somewhat sort of optimistically or even aspirationally in a sort of not all theater way. Inside the industrial complex of theater, there is plenty of power that is unexamined. There is expensive infrastructure that is hard to get into. There is a real legacy of universalizing Western European practice. And those are all very true. And tonight, I'm not trying to sidestep them, but I'm talking about some other things, in part because the critique of the practices are so complete at the moment, or so all-encompassing, that I'm a little curious about what can we pull from these practices. And also, as someone who's practiced outside of the mainstream of contemporary practice, I don't really want to answer for what the Arts Club does. But I also do want to identify sort of the Mangle of my life and the process that comes, because I'm not universalizing that. I was born and raised in Port Hood, Cape Breton, which is on the East Coast, by a bunch of hippie come-from-aways. These folks here, that's my mom, that's me, it's my fairly unimpressed grandmother who was visiting, and my cousins and uncle. And they moved there because we didn't grow on the South Shore of Nova Scotia, in part, but also a lot of them were Americans. My dad had moved up to work at NASCAD, hadn't found that so useful, the College of Art and Design. And, we're moving to Cape Breton to be potters, furniture makers, and in my mother's case, drive school bus and edit the local newspaper, which is part of why they left in '81, because there were limits to that. And then I was in Halifax, and I grew up in Halifax. This is my mom and her partner, Brenda, at the time. One thing I'll say is she's much younger than I am now, and that's an Older Dyke t-shirt right there. That's a printed t-shirt that says Older Dyke on it. She's probably 34. So just to put some context to the 80s and 90s. And so I grew up inside political and artist households as a sort of normative event in Halifax. My mom was an out lesbian and an activist, started the first feminist newspaper in Canada, Pandora, out of Halifax. And so that was just sort of part of my life. And my dad was involved in the Halifax dance community as a board member, and so I went to a lot of shows. This is me in Vancouver in school. So whenever I go around campus and I'm like, wow, those undergrads are a lot, I just think of this picture. And I go, yeah, we are a lot. So this is SFU. I came out here. My mother was already living out here, but I came out and went to Simon Fraser in an undergrad when it was still up the hill for the theater program. And then I've made my art life in Toronto. Basically, these are a lot of pictures that at least Leora will recognize a bunch of. But I worked there very briefly right after university before going back to Halifax for a bit. And then from 2004 to 2017, and really 2004 through 2011, I made a lot of work with a group of people around Hub 14, which was a small studio space, a little smaller than this room, in which we made a lot of work, and a lot of work came out of that. And I'll be coming back to that stuff. Whitehorse, this is the Yukon River. This is what I see on my walk to work every day in the Yukon. And I've been there since 2017 as the artistic director of Nakai. And then 2013 and 14, I'm here. So that's how I get to this point. A Mangle of my practices is I work in theater. I work in theater that is uncommon. Is not the mainstream of theater. But it does, we do share some things. I mean, I am interested mostly in the liveness of theater. I'm interested in this, humans in a room together, in the same space at the same time. I'm interested in what that can do, in part because it makes me incredibly anxious and stressful, but also I think it may be the only thing that will save us. And it's like how we got here. Like we got here by our ability to meet up in groups of people and figure shit out. Like that's how we got, electronics. And so, so I like big ideas. I mean, down the line. Also retellings, and I think theater is an art form that tells the same stories over and over again. At the time of Oedipus, that wasn't a new story. Nobody was like, oh my God, he did what to who? That was a story that they all knew coming in, right? And theater is perhaps a thing of telling stories over and over again. I think in the current moment, we're in a really new play 40 years. And there's a desire to sort of hide the retellingness. But I think it is part of theater's practice, and in part because we do the same show every night over and over again, and so there's a retelling baked into just the practice of doing the work. For me, there's an importance of silliness, as we'll get into. If you're doing shows about the history and nature of science, like jokes and silliness is really helpful. And also, I think one of the things that appeals to me and is the core of my theater practice is that it's humans, and I think we are fairly silly. And I've never sort of met people who aren't silly, even in the sort of most intensive moments. And then my work has almost always been context specific. So this is a show we made for that studio. Hub 14 was made for the corner of that studio. The work has tried to be specific to its time and place. That's often meant that I'm not in a main sort of building. But it's also meant that shows have turned over and changed over time so that they can remain specific to their context. This is a weird personal map of my influences and dynamics that I don't expect to be meaningful at all, other than to say that this is the kind of weave of things, and each one of these I think I could then go and do one of these for themselves. But, green relatively is like people I know who have influenced my work. And this is just to say that we're all in this tangle, right? And my tangle is incredibly specific to me and my family and my background and the kind of theater I'm interested in. And there's nothing universal about this, other than we all have one. Like that, we all have a complex map. I might grant universality on that, but what's in it is going to be different. But these sort of jumble of people and work from dance to theory, and I've spent a lot of time in that. What that's ended up looking like goes from a map. This is that back corner of a studio that we ran. This is the first show in 2004. Note the clamshell. I know, top of the line. And this is a show that we've done every 7 years since. We had no intention of having this pattern, but we have done it every 7 years since. And so in 2 years, we're due for another edition, perhaps in 100 years. And has done a lot of the things that I actually like about theater, where the practice is that we repeat it. And so Amy, there are lines that when you're 25 and you make jokes about leaving kids behind, that's one kind of joke. When you're 35 and trying to have kids, that's a different kind of joke. And then when you're 42 and now have 2 kids, that's a new joke. And the rule of that show is that we don't change it in order that we have to deal with our 28-year-old selves. And what we were doing. This is this sort of intimate direct address in a kitchen in Videofag in Jordan Tannehill's space in the back room, telling stories about Cape Breton coal miners and the unions. This is a show in Whitehorse, one of the few things we've sort of fully been able to make. 99 stories, not about gold, which is exactly what, or we don't tell all 99, but we tell a bunch of stories that have nothing to do with gold. Reworking the canon has been a part of my practice, whether the Greeks and doing Medea and Antigone, 2 different versions of Antigone of the same production, and to very early versions of Chekhov in, this is Orchard. Also, basically a practice of community theater for and by professional theater people. One of the things that was true in Toronto was that we didn't get a chance to play together, and playing is one of the more key practices. And so off, and now it's back on. Okay, let's just slide that up there. So that's a whirlwind tour through how I get to here and into this Mangle of practice. And so we're back to this. And mapping has also been part of my Mangle of practice, so that's why these are in here. Part of Pickering's work is to talk about science from 2 different frameworks, potentially one of representation, right, that science is an accurate portrayal of the realities of the world, or, and he uses the word performative and lets us theater people into his world, because if you're using these metaphors, we're allowed to play. And so, or performative, which is that a speech that things happen, things do. And so if I have a research question, that research question not only is looking at the world, but it is doing something. And for him also, the instruments are doing things in the world. And we can ask, what is science doing in the world? And what is it performing? This then gets into a lot of what is performance studies inside of the theater world. academic turn, the sort of performative turn, this thing of saying, like, there is speech act that makes things true. If I say I do in certain contexts, it like does a whole bunch of legal stuff. But also that when we talk or when we make objects, we are creating in the world and not just representing. And as someone who doesn't work particularly in representational theater, these kind of ideas and this breaking apart of the need for representation as the only thing that an art form could do was incredibly important to me, even as the performative turn is not quite where sort of my research and work is in. The idea of doing things on stage rather than representing the things being done on stage has been incredibly important and is part, I think, of the dance work that I was doing. Okay, so there's some blue sheets. We're now going to do this little thing. And so we're going to use, this is a bit from the show, sort of. Does anyone have a number they would like addressed? Just the number. Yeah. In the show, one of the things about this question that I was looking at earlier today is that it very rarely got asked. We mapped, our stage manager tracked what questions, what numbers were called out over the sort of 3 years we did the show on and off. And one is just very rarely asked, I think in part because I think a lot of people are doing random number when they ask. And again, pick a number between 1 and 15, and 15 and 1 are pretty safe. And different people would answer it differently with all the questions. This one was often dinner. That dinner was a very early influence on Darwin. That eating things, and especially eating things on any of these trips, he was dealing with the skeletons of the objects. That one of the ways in which people at that time dealt with the bodies and just saw a huge amount of bodies in a way that we don't. I don't see a lot of chicken carcasses in order to notice the differences, right? Because food is so separated from those things. So I think often we would answer, if we answered, there was something about dinner. I think that was generally our attempt. I'll take one more in case we don't. Another number?
What? Which condition?
No, just the number, sorry.
Okay,
8? Okay. Absolute 0. So this was all part of Dedicated to the Revolutions, a series of shows based on the 7 revolutions that a grade 8 teacher said changed the world. Also, I don't actually know that it was a grade 8 teacher. I have this list in my mind. I don't know where it came from. It was easier in publicity just to blame it on one person. Also, of course, this is a list that is mostly missing things, right? And is mostly entirely European and run by men, right? Like that's what this list is. And very arbitrary. Like that biology isn't in here? Wild. But basically, this was a show in which we tried to demonstrate the difficulty of demonstrating the effects of progress on our lives. We made it over a series of shows, one for each revolution. Do you have any idea how fast you were going for the industrial, connect the dots, I keep dropping shit, Newton. It'll take a while, people reasonably disagreeing, which was a debate about be it resolved, the printing press has nothing left to do. It's a matter of scale for nuclear. We never did. Not everything revolves around you, which was the Copernican. But that's because we ended up doing the show. Now, this is what, when I talk about silliness, this is what these shows look like. Amy and Frank are demonstrating anonymous posting via semaphore in the Connect the Dots show, which had a lot of jokes about MySpace. This is Chad about to be a model for our song about learning the keys on the keyboard, preparing for the debate, singing about why nobody rides horses to Montreal anymore. That's what trains are for. And here is a little video.
I am really
We followed our genuine curiosity in preparing this show for you. None of us are scientists, and none of us are experts in science, a fact for which we do not apologize. And now we're going to sing you a song. This is our frail contribution,
I've been embracing a dot matrix.
dedicated
Who
to
can print the Bible faster?
the revolutions, 7 picked, almost at random, though some did occur in tandem, and though we offer few solutions, we remain dedicated to the revolution.
And we sing, hey, hooray for progress. You put us in
We're going
our
to speed things
place.
up a little bit now.
You dropped us off here and drove right along, and I'm trying to keep the pace.
Let's drift until the paradigm shifts. Forms a new alliance we call science. If things are known, things we know always change, and with such changes the world shifts, is rearranged.
Still we sing, hey, hooray for progress. You put us in our place. You dropped us off here and drove right along, and I'm trying to keep the hey, hooray for progress. You put us in our place. You dropped us off here and drove right along, and I'm trying to keep the pace. Thanks, we hope that helps.
So yeah, we did that show. After developing it, we did it first at Buddies in Bad Times, and then took it on the road to Calgary, Edmonton, and Halifax at various points. And it was a show that, for me, sort of established my practice. This was a period where what we did together in creating these, I was just really into whiteboards. And so the show had 30 some odd whiteboards, and we would sort of write on them and bring them up and try to use them to answer people's questions. And also to say that we also use them to say, there's one in here, you need to believe in progress. There's one of them that says, I don't agree with that, which is also that somebody could be saying something, a question, and another performer would walk up with a sign that said, I don't agree with that, but that there was agency inside that. So let's do another question. 6. Great. In retrospect, this one probably involved like most of our bad science. Like there was a lot of, because the point is that we're not very good at it. But basically strong force. Right? Like there's strong and weak forces and there's gravity, but so strong force is what holds everything together. That's the force that it's doing. Aimé would often talk about like love and solidarity as the things that kept everything together. The questions would vary, and so we would have rounds of 3, and we would know, if Aimé had just given a love and solidarity question, then I needed to do absolute 0 question. And so we would play with this sort of balance in the show of these question periods. And I'll take one more. 4? I have to go back. Paperback books. Before rail travel, buggies are just too bouncy to read, right? So it's an incredibly bouncy activity to be in a horse-drawn buggy. And so paperbacks and sort of reading while transport wasn't a thing, and so you sat face-to-face and talked to the people. There's a huge amount of literature about the complete dismantling of the social relationships of people because they are no longer talking to each other face-to-face in buggies, but instead are reading paperback novels. And paperback novels is the true sign of the death of conversation and social relations between people, because we are just on our books, on the train. And there's a huge amount of that literature. Like there really is. People thought they were going to go crazy because it was unnatural to see the world pass at that speed. There was a prototype for a horse treadmill on a train where the horse would run on the treadmill on the train, and when the horse was too tired to continue, the train would stop because there was a biological limit to the amount that we should travel in a given day. And so we could tell this biological limit on our daily travel by the amount a single horse could do. So practice for Pickering is not only this sort of cultural extension and transformation in time, his adapting to resistance, but it's also a repeatable sequence of events that we do. And I think about this a lot in theater these days. We have a lot of practices, and trying to think about which one of them are part of the black holes of institutional critique and which are part of a world that I want to live in has been my practice. And theater as a space that is, in parts because of the way I practice, is small, that there are things to do. I can not only practice about sort of how to do, not only this sort of performative act, but we can also work a bit on how to be, which is a third thing, I think, between this performance and representation, is a state of being. And theater has a lot of practices of somatic practices and the practice of warming up for one's day. And of course, there's all these problems and pulls in that, to me, of how do we use these practices for better and not only in the room. That theater might be a thing that we not only need to, that as theater makers, the solution is not that more people have to watch theater, but maybe that more people have to do theater on base levels, or that there's more sort of conversations. And again, not in this sort of screen world. And it does lead me to a sort of mangle of questions in our current moment that I'm working on, and are a little bit of what I'm working on here as part of my MFA. So one is this real thought of how do we maintain uncommon practices at the moment. There are moments in theater where I feel like we're in the stage of, I'm a monk going to remember literacy, and this will be useful again sometime. This is sort of the Station 11 model of theater survival, right? Like, once the apocalypse comes, we will be very useful again, which is not really helpful in my day-to-day life, just as a way to organize my thinking. So how do we do that? What scales does this process of working together with a small group of people collaboratively in any way scale? How can it meet an institution? How to translate to new friends. This work is that I've done is incredibly based in a fairly small social group. And that's incredibly important, I think, to artists and makers in general, to be able to work with your people. And then also, how do I meet students and undergrads who have none of this background for me? And I come back to time and again that it's these people and these things of working with them in special ways outside of the easiest transactional forms, because it's just shit. If you're in it for the transactions, go to a different field. The money's terrible. But the people are great, and there is a certain extent to I found theater for a few reasons. One, it was people, and then they were people kind of like my family, small groups of people trying to change the world, at least for a little bit. And also that the practices were practices that allowed me to work as somebody with, however we want to whatever we want to phrase, our neurospicy mix of the day, whatever language or diagnostic tools fit for that. As someone who has a really hard time showing up for myself, the rules of theater, which are that I have to be there, that the superpower of theater is we show up, and that's just it. Like, that's all we got, is we show up. And we rely on other people to show up, which can be hard when you're selling tickets. And is a little bit of a hard question now. We're in a bunch of questions about if the superpower is showing up, how do we talk about, like, self-care, and I just couldn't do it today. And we're in a balance of that. And I know that for me, in part, the structure and the practice has been what allowed me to work. It wasn't, it was the adaptation to my own resistance. And my resistance just wants to stay in bed and play video games. Like, that's all it wants to do. But the need to be there, the need to show up in a room to make some things up with other people I care about who care about the same things, that seemed valuable. And I do think there are some practices out of our training that continue to happen, and that these are sort of the things I'm working with, and at UBC specifically working with also the questions of how do those values meet the constraints of the moment, which are, both institutional and stress and fatigue and, all the things in our lives. Thanks. Hope that helps.